This
You guys.
conference will now be recorded.
We are almost ready to start as folks join us. Maybe one more minute. Well, I guess we'll get started. We have some introductory slides, so folks jump in the next couple of minutes. They'll still hear all the good stuff from Lisa. Thank you for folks who have joined us. This is the River Management Society's River Management Roundtable. So if that's what you're intending to do, that's where you are. Thank you for being here, and we're going to be hearing about a really awesome, interesting subject from someone who is also pretty awesome and interesting on the increasing the relevancy of rivers to diverse visitors and adaptations for how we communicate.
Thanks, Risa. My name's Becca, and I'm the Communications Coordinator with RMS. And I just will share real quick, if you're not familiar with RMS or you're not a member, we are a national nonprofit organization that supports professionals who study, protect, and manage rivers. And this is just one of the ways that we do that. We get together twice monthly, and we have river management roundtables on 2 different tracks of topics. So we have On the River, which is more operational, technical, day-to-day issues that you face as river managers. And then that's on the second Tuesday. And on the fourth Tuesday of the month, we talk about workplace culture issues and equity and inclusion and things like that. So that's what we're in today. So you're always welcome. You don't have to be a member to join us, but we'd love for you to be a member and for you to spread the word about the roundtables. We just heard from Risa, our executive director. Angie Furman is also joining us. She's our River Training Center coordinator. And Lisa Ronald will be leading the discussion today. She's with American Rivers and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coalition.
Thanks, Becca. I just want to remind us today, as we're all listening and participating in discussion, just to respect one another, allow others to be heard, acknowledge and respect, our similarities and differences, as well as speak for ourselves, but also contribute to the process by making connections and, keeping your comments concise and relevant. So with that being said, I'd like to pass it over to Lisa to introduce herself maybe a little bit more and go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for joining us today.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for RMS for the opportunity to engage with you today. So I'm just going to share my screen. I have a presentation that I'm going to go through, but we have several interactive exercises that we're going to do together starting shortly. However, so although I work for both American Rivers and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coalition, I'm adapting some work that grew out of my previous job working in wilderness. So I've worked for the University of Montana for the Wilderness Institute for nearly 20 years before joining the staff at American Rivers and continuing to work with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coalition. I'm located on the current and ancestral homelands of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, which is otherwise known as Western Montana and Missoula, Montana. So this work that I'm adapting to the river space today came out of an effort that I undertook with a variety of other people. So this was a group of people who came together who had a lot of different identity characteristics, many of which have been long marginalized in wilderness and in conservation. And we undertook a reflective assessment of equity in wilderness communications. And so the adaptations to the river space have come out of that work. And so RMS has asked me to sort of adapt a little bit of this so that some of this information can sort of take life in the river space. So I want to address a question that I have gotten just right out of the box. So you might sort of look at the previous slide and ask yourself, okay, why am I, a white woman, speaking about this topic? And so I just want to give a moment to answer that question and acknowledge that I'm not the only person from this group of individuals who is speaking out within and beyond the wilderness community about equity issues in communications. But I also believe that my role as a member of multiple dominant identity groups means that I have a responsibility to, as an ally, to use my privilege and to use my voice for change. So I like to think of this also as, why me is a valid question, but why not me is also a valid question. So today I'm going to be covering some background, then we're going to be exploring some communications norms related to how we communicate about rivers and the values of rivers through some interactive exercises. That's going to help us identify some interpretations that we may have that we may be prioritizing in the way that we talk about rivers. And I'll give some examples of inclusive communications alternatives as we progress. So I first want to just acknowledge that all of us are here because we are on a DEIJ journey, and all of our journeys look really different. All of our journeys feel really different. This is a little bit of maybe what my journey has looked like. And I hope that today you're empowered in wherever it is that you are in your journey, to be engaged and to be excited and to continue in a trajectory of learning. So let's dive in here. First, I just want to very quickly contrast projections about U.S. population demographics with what we know about participation in outdoor activities. So we know that the U.S. is fast approaching a time when whites will no longer be the numeric majority in the U.S. Yet, participants in outdoor recreation and outdoor activities, even post-COVID, so even after we've seen these dramatic increases in people getting outside, outdoor recreation participants are still largely white. And so in exploring some of our communications norms, I want to make sure that we have a common definition of some of the diversity words that you may be very, very familiar with now. So I want to sort of apply these words to what we're talking about when we're using these in the river space. So we want people with a lot of different identity characteristics to be well represented, both as river visitors and in the river stewardship workforce, in which many of you may work. We also want all of these people to genuinely feel welcome. We want them to feel that river culture is their culture too. We want to give everyone fair access and opportunity to be both a river visitor and a part of the river stewardship workforce. And to do that, we need to acknowledge and work to dismantle some of the systems and structures that continue to create inequity. So everything from hiring practices that look at the recruitment, retainment, and advancement of people in river management careers, to our interpretive information at boat ramps, to regulations and how those are implemented, to consultation with Indigenous nations. So there's a lot of different systems at play here. You're also going to hear me use some words today, obviously some terms, and just to make sure that we all are clear on what those are. Some of these also you may be familiar with, others you may not. Probably the one that you may not be familiar with that I use is systemically excluded people and groups. So this is a very, very broad label that I tend to use and tend to apply to anyone who's been and continues to be discriminated by racist or colonialist policies or certain dominant cultural norms and practices. BIPOC or POC, those acronyms you may be more familiar with. I tend to try to use indigenous nation to recognize the sovereignty of indigenous governance and indigenous entities, and in a general use sense, obviously using the name of a particular indigenous nation, such as the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, when referring to those entities in particular. And then lastly, the LGBTQIA+, that's again an acronym you may or may not be familiar with, that includes and encompasses a lot of different gender identity and gender expression terms. So today we're talking about communications, and so it's to acknowledge that communications is one piece of all of the work that your organization or your agency may do. It's also one piece of work related in conservation culture, but I would argue that it is pretty fundamental to these other pieces. So inclusive communications can help you have more authentic relationships with your coworkers. So it can influence your formal and informal internal dialogues within your organization. It can influence the quality of the relationships that you have with partners, and determines in large part your ability to be effective at forging new partnerships, which is something that we're all doing, I think, now and in our work in conservation. It can influence relationships with volunteers. It can color public contacts that you have out in the field or in your offices, and it can also color public perceptions of you and your organization and the role your organization plays in your community. So communications and inclusive communications are pretty powerful in their impact in how your organization functions. So how do we make our river-focused communications more inclusive? So this is where we're about to get interactive here. We're going to acknowledge a concept that's going to drive and sort of appear throughout the rest of what I'm going to talk about. That's going to allow us to scrutinize some of our communications norms that include language, imagery, concepts about rivers. And that's going to let us understand why some of these communication norms may exclude certain people and groups. So this concept is acknowledging different interpretations. And so what this means is that different interpretations as applied to communications means that for any given word, image, or concept, some people are going to interpret it one way and others will interpret it differently. So as an example, I like to use the word solitude, which is, a little bit more relevant in the wilderness space, but definitely relevant, in the wild and scenic river space, particularly when we look at the wild designated wild and scenic rivers. So if we look at different interpretations of the word solitude, one interpretation is that, solitude is a positive thing. It is a privacy and a silence and a respite from our built world. And so that is often an interpretation in conservation that we have. However, there are different interpretations of the meaning of the word solitude. So for example, if you are familiar with the criminal penal system and something called solitary confinement, that is an interpretation of solitude that is very different. So solitude, depending on your background and your upbringing and your culture and a lot of other factors about you, you may have a different interpretation of what solitude means. You may instead feel that solitude is not so positive, that it is a lonely experience, that it is isolating, that solitude is a space where you as a person may be unsafe or you may feel unsafe. So this isn't to say that one of these interpretations is more important, nor is one of them correct and another one incorrect. This is something to acknowledge that, when we have very different interpretations of a word or a concept and we prioritize one over another, that's a space where we can start to create exclusivity. So here's another example. If we look at this picture, those of us who like rivers and we like river recreation, we may look at this picture and we may think, wow, this looks really exciting. This is an adventure. This is sort of a moment of adrenaline before we're about to sort of pitch over the edge of the rapid. Another interpretation is that this could be scary, dangerous, cold, expensive. Right? So some other interpretations of the meaning that is derived from this image. So there's multiple meanings that we can derive from this. So this is where we're going to start doing some interactive exercises. So how we talk about rivers often takes the form of a story. So when we talk about rivers, we often talk about how they came to be and why they're important to us now and why we should care about them, what's special about them. And often in the context of that story, we tend to include events and people as a way to convey information. So we're going to take a look at some aspects of our river story. And so I'm going to show you a series of pictures of people. I'm also going to give you their names. And I would like you to type into the chat who these people are. So you see the picture, you recognize the person, type their name into the chat, and I want you to tell me something about them. If you recognize the name, you say, oh, so-and-so did X, Y, or Z. So go ahead and type that into the chat, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So here's the first picture. Who are these people? Go ahead and type that into the chat. I'm going to go ahead and give you their name. Good. Okay, so we have folks identifying John and Frank Craighead, who are the brothers from Montana, who are largely credited with the idea behind the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So let's try this again. Who is this person? Another person. I'm going to give you a name. Good. So this is David Brower. He's the first executive director of the Sierra Club, and he was influential in early advocacy against dams, specifically the Echo Park and the Grand Canyon dams. Now let's try this person. I'm going to go ahead and give you this person's name. Tell me something about this person if you recognize this woman. Okay, so this is Gloria Brown. Gloria became the first female African-American forest supervisor in 1999. Good, someone identified she's from the Forest Service. She managed Oregon's Siuslaw National Forest. She's also the co-author of a memoir that was published last year. And she paved the way within the Forest Service for names that are more recent that you may recognize, the names of Leslie Weldon and now Chief Randy Moore. Okay, so let's try this person. Who is this person? All right, I'm going to give you a name. Tell me something about this person. Yes, so this is Senator Frank Church. So we recognize Senator Frank Church. He's a senator from Idaho. As it relates to Wild and Scenic Rivers, he introduced the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act into Congress in 1964. One of the largest wilderness areas in the U.S., in Idaho, the Frank Church River of No Return is another name for the Middle Fork Salmon River, Wild and Scenic River in Idaho. All right, so let's try this person. I'll give you a name here. Let me know if you know anything about this person here. All right, so this is Perry Cohen. Perry is a transgender individual who founded the Venture Out Project in 2014 to offer outdoor experiences, including river trips, for the queer and transgender community. All right, let's try this one. Do you recognize this person and this name? Great. So Jose Gonzalez founded Latino Outdoors in 2013. And Gary, I'm glad you got this one. So Latino Outdoors is now a national organization that connects Latinx families with nature. All right, we're going to try a couple more here. Who is this person? Yay! Okay, so we got a variety of folks recognize Tim Palmer, who is well-known river author, photographer, historian. All right, how about this person here? Go ahead and give you a name as well. All right, so Dina is the author of As Long as Grass Grows, the Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. She has written extensively about Indigenous connections to and the significance of water to Indigenous peoples. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and give you this name as well. Anyone recognize this person? Okay, this person's name is Tracy, and Tracy founded Brown Folks Fishing in 2018. All right, so last one. Anyone recognize this person? Okay, this is great. So this person is Lily Durkee, who is one of the co-founders of Diversify Whitewater, which is an organization founded in 2020 to promote DEI in paddle sports. So typically what happens when I do this exercise, and I think some of that has definitely been repeated here, is that we see a common theme happening, and that is that there are certain people in our river story that I would say are famous. People that we recognize pretty immediately, either by picture or by name. And then there are people who we don't recognize. And so I would argue that we have sort of the exercise that we did breaks out down into two groups. We have our famous people, which tended to be the people that we recognize, and then we have our uncelebrated folks. And so let's take a little bit closer look about why this is happening, right? If we look at like why we just saw the phenomenon that we did. So I would argue that there are some different characteristics, identity characteristics in particular, that are different between people on the famous list versus people on the uncelebrated list. So I would suggest that people on our famous list tend to be members of the dominant conservation culture. So these people are often older. Some of them are deceased. They tend to be well-educated, upper middle class, often male. And sometimes that was at a time, when women didn't have rights or women had fewer rights than they do now. They typically tend to be able-bodied people who were part of these early conservation conversations, recognizing that our river protection movement is an outgrowth of sort of an earlier conservation movement that involves some of the same characters as we see in wilderness, national monuments, other facets of conservation now. We have sort of different buckets of conservation now, and they have a common root together. Now you contrast those identity characteristics with the identity characteristics of our uncelebrated people, and someone just brought up, yes, a lot of them are white, and that is also a piece here. And so our uncelebrated people, though, in contrast, are generally not white. Some of them are younger, or they might still be alive, which speaks to a certain definition that the dominant culture has about what constitutes history and what doesn't, right? Some of these people have identity characteristics, or they are members of systemically excluded groups, and their rights were not recognized until more recently in time. A lot of these people were not part of these early conservation conversations. These folks may hold different non-dominant worldviews, or just different ways in which they connect with rivers and have relationships with rivers. And they may be champions of causes that our dominant conservation culture considers peripheral or unrelated to conservation. So there's some differences in the identities of the people that we recognized on that famous list and the uncelebrated list. Now, where in communications we can get into trouble is when we prioritize one interpretation of river history and culture, which means that we only tell the river story with our famous actors. So at the end of each of these exercises, I'm going to challenge you with a personal exercise. And so here I would challenge you to learn about 5 new people who are not currently part of your typical river narrative, and to include those people in your narrative going forward so that you have a richer set of both famous and uncelebrated people that represent how you convey the value of rivers in your river story. Okay, so another exercise. We're going to do another exercise together. So I'm going to again show you a series of pictures. This is a series of images of how we often show river recreation experiences and the way that people interact with rivers. I'm going to show you these pictures individually, and then we'll see them together at the end, and we'll talk a little bit about them. When you see these pictures, I want you to do 2 things. I want you to identify inclusive elements that you think are missing from the pictures. I also want you to identify things that you see in the pictures that are present, but you think might be exclusive. And I want you to type those things into the chat. So 2 things that are missing and things that are present that you think are exclusive. So let's get started. So don't be shy. Feel free to fire off your thoughts into the chat about things that you think are missing in these photos and things that you see that you think might be exclusive in nature. Great. See a couple comments coming in. We see a lot of expensive gear present. Okay, so let's take a look at these images all together. And these images come from a variety of different sources, different photographers, different places, lots of different sources here. So I see some really good things coming into the chat, everything from suburban and urban environments are missing to the number of people, the types of ages of people, the skin color of people in the pictures. So I want to try to distill some of that into what we see. So oftentimes, unintentionally, we can show river recreation in a very specific way that often mirrors the statistics that I already showed about what or who is participating in outdoor recreation activities. And so that means that in these pictures, we see a lot of the same types of identity characteristics of both the people, and then there are some commonalities in the settings. And so I just want to distill some of that, and then we'll take another look at the pictures. So oftentimes we show people who are participating in river recreation as being young, white, male, athletic, right? We saw a lot of young, white, athletic men in these pictures. We also saw a lot of young, white, athletic men who were alone in the pictures. And even though, if we think about it, we know that like, okay, someone's taking the picture. So clearly there's at least one more person sort of in this scene. The pictures themselves are often taken in a way that encourages us to think about like this person being alone or being in a small group. And this is quite a bit more true, I think, in wilderness than it is in river recreation, but still somewhat true here. We also see these young white athletic men who are often alone, engaging in activities that require a lot of gear, skill, and knowledge, and multiple people picked up on that piece. I would also argue that in addition to the gear parts of it, we see an appetite for challenge in these pictures, in many of these pictures. And certainly that depends how you personally define challenge, whether you see challenge in these activities or not. But I would argue that, that in a lot of these activities, an appetite for challenge is very apparent. We also see most of these people interacting with rivers in a way that can suggest some masculine stereotypes of strength, endurance, and a commodification. I think the one where I see that the most in this suite of pictures is the person standing on the mountain, sort of looking down over the river. There's a certain feeling of conquest that we get when I look at that photo. That's one of the things that I pick up on. So if we have these certain identity characteristics, we also have some characteristics of the settings that we often show people in. So we often place these actors in really remote settings. So settings that are intended to look remote, and that often suggest things like purity, like etherealness of the backdrop. We love to see really beautiful pictures of rivers, but we often show these very non-peopled looking places to convey a remoteness of nature in, as a space where these people with a certain identity who are participating in river recreation are placed. So I want to just show these pictures one more time and just give you 10 seconds here to look and see if there's something that you see now that you might not have seen earlier. Okay, so this begs the question, if we are prioritizing a certain type of actor, a certain type of person who's located in a certain setting, and we are constantly showing a lot of that, who could we be excluding when we adhere to that conservation communications norm? So there's a variety of different identity characteristics, and I've listed some of them on the right-hand side list here that we could be excluding. So we could be excluding people who are older, people of color. Many of you noted the absence of people of color in the photographs. We may be excluding women or people who have a non-binary fluid definition of gender when we prioritize masculine stereotypes. We may be excluding people who like to recreate in families or groups, either by preference or as a prerequisite for safety, when we frequently show people alone or in very small groups. We may be excluding people who value calm, relaxing, cheap leisure activities if we are constantly showing people engaging in recreational activities that require a lot of money, time, knowledge, and challenge, and an appetite for challenge. We may be excluding people who have different ways in which they connect with nature when we show sort of commodified recreation, masculine stereotype interactions with nature. And finally, we might be excluding people who either need to or value recreating in a peopled feeling location, either again by preference or as a prerequisite for safety, when we constantly show these remote ethereal locations and landscapes as a backdrop for river recreation. So personal challenge here. So this is just a thought exercise to suggest to you the next time that you're on the river. I would challenge you to deliberately assess your privilege. And this is a little harder than you might think it is. So for example, one of my points of privilege that you might not know about me is that I am of average height. And believe it or not, that is a privilege. So when I assess my privilege, I'm trying to do that in a really multifaceted way. And then I'm going to connect my privilege to my river enjoyment values. So as someone of average height, I never have a problem finding gear that fits me. I never have to order a custom dry suit. I don't have to worry about whether boats are going to fit me if I'm trying to find a kayak on the used market, right? There are a whole variety of pieces of privilege there that come into play with something as minor a piece of privilege as my average height, right? So think about your privilege and how that supports your personal river values and the way that you interact with rivers. And then try to think about, okay, what's the opposite of that? So what does it feel like for someone who is not of average height? And what are some of the challenges that that person faces? So why would I ask you to do this? So understanding how various aspects of your identity influence how you relate to rivers gives you greater awareness of the ways that you communicate the values of rivers. So your identity, whether you're aware of it or not, colors how you talk about river recreation to other people. And so if you are more self-aware of your own defaults, that enables you to better adapt your communications for different audiences in different situations. Okay, so last interactive exercise. This time we're going to look at words. We looked at some pictures and some people, and now we're going to look at words. So I'm going to show you some words that we very, very frequently use in conservation. So whether we're writing them or talking about them, we use these words a lot. And I don't want you to give it a lot of thought. When the word comes on the screen, I want you to just fire off what you think this word means. What does it mean to you? And I just want you to type your thought into the chat. Okay, so first word is the word protect. What does the word protect mean to you? Super, lots of good thoughts. Let's keep that going. What about the word preserve? What does the word preserve mean to you? Awesome thoughts coming in. All right, we're going to do two more. What about the word resource? What does the word resource mean to you? All right, and last word. What does the word pristine mean to you? Great. Okay, some great thoughts. So we're going to return now to the concept that we first visited upon in the examples of the word solitude and the rafting picture. So this notion of different interpretations. And so we often use the words protect and preserve. Sometimes, those kind of go together. They're two very common conservation verbs. We often apply them to nature. So I saw several of you say protect rivers or protect against pollution or protect something. And so I would suggest that there are some different interpretations for these words that we use really commonly in a very particular way in conservation. So if we instead add a subject to this instead of an object, so if normally we use it in the sense of like, I'm going to protect something, what if instead we say protect from whom or preserve for whom, as in a subject versus an object? Does that change the meaning? For me, it definitely does. It makes me think a little bit harder about how someone with a different background and identity might interpret these words. So someone with systemically excluded identity characteristics might think to themselves, okay, protect, does this mean protect from me? Does this mean preserve for someone not me, right? So again, neither one of these interpretations of these verbs is correct or more important. I'm just sort of trying to open our minds a little bit to the fact that there are different interpretations of some of our common language. Let's explore another one. So with the word resource, we often, again, we refer to nature as a resource, and we often use the word resource to imply some of the positive benefits that we derive from nature. Nature is a resource for us as humans. Alternatively, a different interpretation is that resource can be viewed as an extractive thing, that it can have utilitarian extractive implications. And lastly, if we look at pristine, several of you said, you know, sort of clean, pure, undeveloped, pristine. We often use the word pristine as an adjective to apply to rivers or other pieces of nature. A different interpretation is that this does not recognize or acknowledge indigenous uses or in long-time indigenous habitation and modification of the environment. So again, just some different interpretations of some of the common language that we use in conservation. So the last personal challenge that I want to leave you with is that I would challenge you to list out the most common words that you use when you're talking and writing about rivers. And think deliberately about what interpretations you derive from that language. And then think about what words within the common list that you use could have some different interpretations or meanings, and how you might assess what those are. All right, so up until this point, we've somewhat looked at the subject of communications from a what not to do lens, right? We've looked at here are some things that are commonly happening that maybe we shouldn't do, right? So now I'm going to try to flip this around and share some advice that I've developed to guide some of my communications practices and look at some examples of how this actually looks in practice. So I've created a sort of a short list of okay, as a communicator, what can I do that is positive? So I can think about the way that I organize information, and I can not always default, for example, to a chronological organization. I can be more mindful of the importance that and the precedent that I put on time when I'm communicating. And I can think about, are there other ways that I can organize this information in a way that doesn't use time? So a geographical way of organizing information is a great example of that. If I am using time references, when am I starting my time? Am I starting with colonial time references, or am I starting, for example, with time immemorial? So I can choose when and how to include time in my communications. So can I broadly define the influence of different people and events within the river movement by balancing, remember, our famous and our uncelebrated events and people and groups and different figures? So I can balance that out. I can take a look at who my actors are in a story, and I can try to make sure that I have some level of balance between famous and uncelebrated actors. Can I acknowledge indigenous habitation and land and river management practices? Can I do a better job of that by something even as simple as elevating indigenous place names and indigenous words, obviously, if correctly researched and done so in collaboration with indigenous partners? Can I describe oppressive historical events more honestly? And can I try to offer multiple perspectives of their meaning and their impacts? And finally, can I prioritize the agency and self-determination of those who have been systemically excluded? I can consider doing things like coupling resilience and tragedy. So often, if we're sort of, again, organizing things by time, we have tragedy occurs first, and then at some later point, we have resilience. If those events are uncoupled, we can run the risk of victimizing people or groups. And finally, can I look at ways of portraying systemically excluded people that are not stereotypical? Can I avoid some of the stereotypes that exist? So this is how some of that can actually look sort of in practice. So here are some examples. Some of these are mine, some of these are not mine. So one of the things in my previous position with the Wilderness Institute that I thought was really important was to do a much better job of sort of balancing our famous and our uncelebrated figures in the conservation story that is common to both wilderness and river movements today. So I tried to do a bunch of research and to better balance what I would argue are traditional conservation figures like Ansel Adams with more uncelebrated voices. So this is just some screen snaps, and I will send this list out to this group later. I think we have some resources that RMS is going to send out as a follow-up. So in this list, you see, dead people, live people, women, people of color, people with disabilities, just a lot of different types of people. So tried to make this list much more comprehensive and much less slated towards deceased white men, which is sort of the list that I had started with. A really simple and great long-standing example is rivers.gov. Rivers.gov uses an interactive map to promote a geographical organization of information. So again, this is a very easy tool that really prioritizes a place-based approach to thinking about the world as opposed to a time or another sort of organizational mind frame. This is an excerpt from a much larger sort of historical piece that is one way, certainly not the only way, of looking at more honest accounting of historical trauma and acknowledging the different meanings of the same event. So this looks at a pivotal event in that all of us, I think, learned about in public school. If you've gone to public school, you generally learned a lot about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well, there are some other pieces to that. And so I think, explaining it, and I'm just going to read the last sentence here, which is sort of the crux. While some view the Lewis and Clark expedition as the discovery of the West, it also symbolizes the invasion and seizure of indigenous homelands by European settlers espousing manifest destiny. So there are different interpretations of the Lewis and Clark story, and many of us in history class just learned one of those stories. So trying to acknowledge that there are different interpretations and perspectives about this same event. Okay, so a couple of examples from a really great resource. This is Elements of Indigenous Style. This is a book, a language book that you can get from the library. So the example on the left, the numbered treaties provided First Nations with reserves, education, and healthcare. This is a style of explaining a particular concept that communicates paternalism. Now you contrast that with the example on the right, which is through the negotiation of the numbered treaties with Canada's government, First Nations established their present day and continuing treaty rights to reserves, education, and healthcare. This better emphasizes the agency and self-determination of the people in question, right? So there's some nuanced language differences here that are important, and this book does a great job of laying those out and providing some sort of like before and after types of examples. So here's another one from this same book. The fur trade swept up indigenous peoples in a new economy based on supplying beaver pelts to French and English traders. An explanation that in which indigenous peoples are acted upon. Contrast that with what's on the right. Indigenous peoples engaged in the new economy of the fur trade, in which they supplied beaver pelts to French and English traders in exchange for European goods. So in this different explanation, we have indigenous peoples acting as opposed to being acted upon. So again, these can be a little tricky, so I like the way that this book provides some good examples of sort of how to adapt that language to get at some of these more nuanced and non-sort of vocabulary-based language changes. Okay, so last example. This is an example from American Rivers, recently published Lolo and Bitterroot National Forest Wild and Scenic River Eligibility Report. And in that report, we did a bunch of research with Indigenous representatives from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And in the way that we've chosen to express this, sort of in this report, we are prioritizing Indigenous place names. And you'll notice that we have Indigenous names first with English translation in parentheses. So that's a simple way to sort of subordinate the English translation. There's also, references in the language here that talk about Indigenous peoples both in the present and in the past. So not just in the past, but also in the present. As part of the work that I've done here, I've compiled an inclusive language guides list, and this will be sent out following this session, along with the conservation personalities listing, to share that with you folks. So these are just resources that I found really helpful. Some of them are more granular in nature, that they say, like, use this word and not this other word. And some of them are a little bit more complex, such as the elements of Indigenous styles. So good resources to take advantage of. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions in the time that we have remaining. And you can reach me at American Rivers at lronald@americanrivers.org anytime. So I think we have probably a small enough group that we can just do verbal questions. If folks have verbal questions, I'm happy to do it that way.
Lisa, that was awesome. I have a in the weeds question. Is it patronizing? I liked how you mentioned subordinating an English word, in parentheses after a native word. Is it patronizing because we might not be familiar with that alphabet to put a pronunciation thing before the English word? I see the word, but I could never say it because I can't pronounce that language. But I'm English, I'm English.
Yeah, and I think if you're not sure, the best advice that I have tried to take is, if you're not sure, ask the tribe. Is this how they would want this to be shown? Is this the correct spelling? Does this have the correct accents, et cetera, et cetera? And so that at least was the work that was done. There were a bunch of questions that were asked to be able to say, okay, this is technically how this word actually exists in the Salish language. The word Salish, as we pronounce it in English, is the English translation. So I think just if you're not sure, asking is the best way to make sure that you're not doing something that's patronizing, because there may definitely be some tribes or people who do not want to be referred to in a particular way, and they should self-define that. So I think just asking if you're not sure is the best way to do that. Other questions? We have what, five-ish minutes?
Hey, Lisa, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Ben.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much for your presentation. I was curious, do you have any resources or examples where, I don't know, maybe studies have been conducted on how the public perceives these changes? Is it actually working? Is it becoming more relevant? How the use of changing the language impacts the the user experience? Or is this just kind of a coalition of best practices and diversity, equity, inclusion? Is there any evidence that it's working?
I'm not aware of studies specifically on the impact of the use of DEIJ language. I know that just language in general, and there's a great article that I'm thinking of that I'll have to dig up, but it's sort of like language is always changing. And there's debate in sort of society and in environmental justice sectors on well, what is how is language changing, and how are the interpretations of it, and how are the effects of it changing? as the language changes. So if you want, Ben, you can email me afterwards and I'll dig up this article because that might be a relevant piece for you to dig into. I think one thing that I definitely am seeing, and particularly at, having moved from like an academic job, now moving into the nonprofit sector, is that sort of language and sort of communications use guides are a very sort of like super low tier DEIJ resource that organizations are being provided. So it's sort of the expectation that like, okay, yes, you're going to read this and you're going to use this, but there's also so much more to it than that. And that there's the expectation that, sort of trainings and consultation with, colleagues and other experts is going to help inform you beyond strictly language related resources. But that's sort of a stepping stone, a sort of low level stepping stone that is being commonly provided.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely send you an email for sure.
Yeah, and I can look that. I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, but I know exactly where to find it. So I can get that and share that with you.
Thanks.
Other questions?
I'm going to say this, no one's chatting.
You know where to find me. So if you do think of questions after the fact, feel free to reach out to me at lronald@americanrivers.org. I'll just put that in the chat, and you can feel free to reach out to me anytime. So thank you all for your time. Much appreciated.
Well, everyone, just before we go, I want to share a link to a quick survey. It's only a couple of questions and it helped us out tremendously. There's also Angie's email in there where you can send future topics. So if there's something that's relevant for you, we'd love to hear about it. But thanks so much, Lisa. That was awesome. Oh, wait, I sent this message. Let me see. I'm trying to put the link in here. Yeah, just super helpful going beyond like this word instead of that word. So thanks a bunch for that. And our next river management roundtable is going to be October 11th with Duncan Hay and an architect, and they're going to be talking about what does ADA for river access really mean. It's a lot more nuanced than you would think, so it's going to be a really interesting topic. So be sure to register for that. Like Lisa said, we have recorded. We will send out the recording, and we'll also share some of these resources and Lisa's email as well. So if you didn't catch that, you will be getting it in your inbox. You can watch our other river management roundtables in the River Training channel. We also have a lot of different workshops and webinars that we've held in the past that are in there. So if you are looking for something specific, check it out. They're all categorized and very helpful resources. We have beyond river management roundtables, several other upcoming training and events coming up. We also have the River Management Symposium coming up in February. So we'd love for you to join us in San Antonio. And if you are interested in presenting, proposals are due this Friday. So it's not too late. We'd love to hear from you. Yeah, thanks for joining us, guys. Here's Lisa's email again, and we hope to see you in a couple of weeks.